Leslie, for joining us today. I'm Tiffany. I'm the board chair for the American Society for the Positive Care of Children. I'm so grateful that you're here with us today to share with our parents and with anyone who is listening in. I'm even more grateful that we were able to meet a couple of weeks ago. And so I'm grateful that we're able to talk today. And for all those listening, if you can please share a little bit about who you are and what Latinx parenting is.
Yeah, so I'm Leslie. You can call me Leslie or Leslie Priscilla. I am the founder of Latinx Parenting, which I started in 2018. Aside from being an organization, I also consider Latinx Parenting a movement that I started honestly out of frustration because there wasn't anything like it that I had seen. It's an organization and a movement that I think I needed when I first started mothering 10 and a half, almost 11 years ago. I'm a mother to three. I think that's like my primary role. I have a 10 and a half year old. She's going to be 11 in February, so pretty soon. Ah. And I have a 5-year old, just turned 5, and then I have a 3.5 year old. And so very busy around my house, but I really started this also not just for my children and for the children that are currently children. I really started this also for our inner children and the children that we were, right? A lot of us have gone through experiences that were not great or not ideal. And so we've had to learn how to kind of hold, balance the awareness of like our cultural values with our parenting values and how those either work well together or sometimes don't work that well together. And so I think Latinx parenting is really the space where these conversations have been able to happen. And I feel very grateful to have been received by the community. I offer a lot of classes, a lot of workshops, a lot of educational opportunities, support opportunities for parents to come together to have these conversations around the different nuances of raising children in bicultural families is really what we're doing, right? So I consider myself a Chicana. I'm first generation, raised by 2 Mexican immigrants. And I felt like, so much of my upbringing, I was straddling 2 cultures. It was like the
Right.
Americanized, very individualistic culture. And then it was the more collectivist Mexican, Latino culture. And so I think for those of us who grew up in that way, it just becomes a lot to reflect on, and to be sustaining of our culture is something that I think is really important for us to continue to reflect on, because I think we can be competent, right? We can be like aware of the culture, but I think that we also want to be very intentional about how we evolve our culture and the kinds of things that we reintegrate into our parenting and into our family dynamics. And so Latinx parenting was really born, from wanting to offer that as a resource because I needed that as a resource and didn't
Right.
have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's actually the reason why American SPCC was founded as well, was
Yeah.
because we realized that, well, the founder, I'm part of we, but the founder, not me, but the founder, and then we, because we continue it. But the founder realized that, all of these organizations and nonprofits, there was so much funding going into just mitigating child abuse, but
Yeah.
also just trying to keep their heads above water when it came to child abuse. I'm in my own community. There's San Antonio, Texas. We end up with the high statistics of over 5,000 children who are reported abused every single year. And that number just rises higher and higher. And so the founder realized that there was nothing that existed of free tools and resources on gentle parenting, very similar to you, on
Mhm.
not only taking care of parents, but addressing generational trauma at the
Yeah.
source, and then breaking that cycle of trauma, because abuse is a
Yeah.
cycle, right?
Yeah.
And wanting to create a world and a future where children aren't even abused because parents have the tools and resources necessary to be healthy parents for themselves, for
Yeah.
their children. And so I love that, you're part of our Trusted Parenting Network. For those who don't know what our Trusted Parenting Network is, please look up americanspcc.org. Leslie Priscilla is an amazing expert on our panel, and we're just so grateful to have you. You were talking about, in that same light, how we're both working towards breaking these cycles of traumas, right? And about how, like, we want to hold tight to our culture, but at the same time honor our future and what we know now, right?
Yeah.
And so in this movement that you've started on ending chancla culture, you know, I'm a mestiza Latina as well. Born and raised in San Antonio, Texas. My dad was born in Coahuila, Mexico. And my mom was actually born in San Antonio too. But Texas has a very interesting history, right? Because so
Mhm.
many of us, the border jumped us.
Yes.
And so, you know, with holding tight to our cultures, and ending chancla culture, you
Mhm.
know, what really helps, like, what really helps empower you when you're working to heal these like inner niñas, right? Like these inner children within ourselves.
Yeah, I think that there's like a misconception. I think when people come into the Latinx parenting space or any parenting space that like, oh no, I'm going to be judged. I'm going to be told not to spank my kid. I'm not going to be understood. I'm going to be evaluated in really negative ways. And those are really valid concerns because that's honestly like our people have walked into a lot of spaces that have done that, that have
Right.
judged, that have created additional shame and additional, oppressive dynamics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even like CPS, right? And just like child protective services, things like that. Like we don't always do the best job systemically of being able to address these issues because we remove them from the source, from the root of it, right? And so that
Right.
is that ancestral trauma, the cultural trauma sometimes. And so I'm not saying that our culture causes trauma. I'm
Right.
saying as a people who were historically oppressed and were on the receiving end of attempted genocide and colonization, it makes sense that a lot of us don't necessarily have the skills or the tools to be able to approach our children in ways that are more regulated in
Right.
us, and seek that connection, right? It's like if I have been told my entire life that I'm not to trust myself, how can I offer trust to my children when I don't even necessarily trust myself,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's compassionate and shame free? And so when people enter the space, like the first thing that I share at least is my own story, and saying I'm not a perfect parent. I'm actually a person who contributes sometimes to chancla culture, and for people who don't know what chancla culture is, for me, it's the manifestation of adult supremacy in Latinx families,
Right.
or any kind of supremacy culture in our families and the ways that we interact with one another, the ways that we feel about ourselves. Like Chancla Culture, and this is a book that I'm writing, really speaks to how we have been so again disconnected from ourselves and how that has seeped into the relationships that we have with our children. And so I perpetuate that because I'm not a perfect person. I'm not a robot, right? That can just get it right 100% of the time.
What?
I know. I'm like, I may not use the physical chancla, but I do use like verbal chancletazo sometimes. And the things that I say when I'm in a state of stress, when I'm in a state of survival, and something that Ross Greene talks about, who wrote the Explosive Child, is he says, it's not a matter for children. He says it's not a matter of will for kids. Like they don't behave in those ways because they're not willing to behave in those ways. It's a matter of skill. And so anytime I hear something like that, I think, well, that actually also applies to parents. It's not a matter of we would love to be connected to our children. We would love to have things be easy for us. We would love to be in a state of flow, but often we don't necessarily have the skills to be able to do that. And I think that there's another misconception that having ideas of child development, brain development, all of these kind of external things that we want to understand about children, that has enough of an impact, And so for me, it was very quickly apparent that because I worked in preschool, I was a preschool teacher. I had all of this knowledge about child development, and then I had my own child, and I was like, this is actually not enough. Like, it's not enough to know these things for me to be able to show up in the ways that I want to show up for this child. And so a lot of the
Right.
inner work had to start coming in. The inner Nina had to be addressed. I had to reconnect with her. I had to heal what her woundedness was. I had to be very accountable to the thorns that she would develop to protect herself.
Right.
That was from her childhood, from my childhood. And that's what we learned. We learned survival. My parents also learned survival, and so we adapted a lot of that. And so it hasn't been easy to be in that flow. It's like, yeah, okay, I know where your brain is. Like I know where my kid's brain is when they're in tantrums, for example. that doesn't necessarily mean that I, in that moment, have the blueprint genetically, socially, environmentally to be able to know how to navigate it. And I hold a lot of privilege. I just want to name that like outright, that as parents, as somebody that's more resourced, like I hold a lot of privilege. And so for some people in our community who don't have access to the same level of privilege, who are not able-bodied, who are not U.S. citizens, who don't
Right,
necessarily have a westernized education, or the knowledge on brain development, child development, who maybe are not housed, who maybe are not employed, things like that. It's going to be a lot harder for those community members to be centered enough to be that
right,
kind of parent, right? And so I place a lot of the responsibility not just on the parents. The parents do what we do, but we need that external support. We need the
absolutely.
new systems,
We need
actually.
community too.
Community, exactly. And so I think what's beautiful about our culture is that we know how to access community. We just forget sometimes. We're a
Right,
colonialist culture, and that comes from indigenous roots that a lot of us do have. But how do we re-access that? And a lot of
right,
us, because of colonization, have been made to feel like burdens that don't deserve that support. That
exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and
it's
that's actually what I was going to say is that a lot of what Chancla culture stems from is that colonization and survival.
mhm,
And so, my dad and I have privilege too, right? And I'm very privileged to have a college degree, to have the support of two parents
mhm,
who did their best, right? But still learn even to this day. And they're even learning now that I'm an adult too, right? And so but I've also worked in the nonprofit industry for the last 13 years, and so I've seen a lot of survival in our community, but with other individuals as well. And so the part about it, about being survival based, is that we were never really fully given the opportunity to express our full selves or our full voices.
mhm.
And so when you think about the chancla, it cuts it off,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it suppresses the voices because those voices were already suppressed, so they just became status quo.
Yeah.
It just became a running thing. And so, I remember when my dad never taught us Spanish because he was hit for speaking Spanish in school.
Right.
And I remember him telling me, never say the word mande,
Mm,
because mande was, what do you command of me?
yeah.
And so when we think back to what chancla culture really is, it's
Yeah.
again putting us in that space of, what do you command of me?
Yeah.
And so breaking chancla culture, not only in words, like verbally, like you were saying, right?
Yeah.
And in action physically, takes a lot of self-awareness, but like you said, it takes a lot of help,
Yeah.
and a lot of grace and a lot of patience, because this has been for a very long time that we've held on to these things that we think we've normalized,
Mhm.
but we don't recognize how it manifests in other ways in other parts of our lives. Like, for example, applying to positions
Yeah.
that you may be fully qualified for, but you don't feel like you're worthy enough because of being shut off so many times. And so when you're operating in that survival mode, it's hard to break out of it, and it's hard to dismantle it so that you can actually be in a space of that self-awareness and that privilege and gratitude and healing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of parents who become parents, it becomes like a catalyst, like a catalyst to kind of recognize what some of those things have been for us, like what some of those
Right,
moments have been for us. So, like the moments where I did not speak up or advocate for myself, like, do I want that for my daughter? And if I don't want that for my daughter, my children, then I need to be very clear about how I move forward in either accepting or not accepting microaggressions, or like these minor moments that feel oppressive to me. I remember once I was working at a preschool, and I like came out the door, and the director, I've never shared this story before actually, but I came out the door And I saw the director walking by, and she was a white woman, blonde white woman. And I said, "Oh, hey, Cecile." And she was like, "Oh, don't scare." Like, she was very upset with me. And I was like, I feel like I'm really in trouble right now. Like, I feel like I didn't do anything wrong, but I
Right.
feel like that dynamic made me feel like I was being watched all the time. I was being, and I do feel like there was a lot of discrimination that I faced being in those spaces that were led by white folks who didn't necessarily care, that about
Right.
diversity, like all these things or whatever. Um, but I feel like I would never do that. I would never put myself in that position now. And part of the reason that I wouldn't is because I have my children that I feel very strongly I want to model different ways of being for, and so, and that's part of the reason I started Latinx parenting also, because I was like, I'm not being supported by the nonprofit industry. I'm not being supported,
Right.
whether it was a huge nonprofit that I was working for, and I was teaching a curriculum that was very behavior based, and that was very, and I wasn't teaching that curriculum, but when they would come and watch me, then I would teach the curriculum.
Right.
But I was teaching nonviolence, and I was teaching trauma informed care, and I was teaching all these things that I felt really passionately about, but I wasn't supported in kind of making that shift for the agency, for the families. Went to a smaller nonprofit, worked at NAMI for a long time, same issues, right? Because the leadership really was disconnected from the community. And so
Right.
for me, I thought, I want to make sure that my primary stakeholder is the parents that are in my classes. Like, they are the ones that are going to shape my awareness of their needs. It's not going to come from this, very removed voice or person that ultimately their bottom line is going to be money and not necessarily meeting the needs of the
Right.
community, right? And so for me, it's been really important um, to take the lessons from that and to be able to integrate them into Latinx parenting and into the work that I do with families.
Well, absolutely, because it's about empowering truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're empowering truth and you're telling true stories, you're allowing other people to be empowered by their own voices and their own truth.
Yeah.
And you're speaking directly to people just like you.
Mm-hmm.
You're speaking to people who needed someone like you, exactly like you said earlier today. And I think that that's so beautiful, and I think that's so important, and I think that's why so many people have resonated to your story as you've continued on your mission, and why, like, you've really created a lot of healing for communities
Yeah.
because of you just being yourself,
Yeah.
right?
And I want to give people so much more credit, because I feel like people, I never want to be seen as like a guru or like anybody that is
Right.
separate from my humanity. Like, again, I mess up so much, like, I'm just a human being. And when I tell parents, I'm like, listen, when it comes down to it, like, you may have the things that I have put together as a resource, but when you're in that situation with your child and that's not on hand immediately, that's all like, and we can be in celebration of any time that you do something different than the harm that was caused to you, right? Even if it was the harm, but then afterwards you recognize the harm, you take accountability for the harm, and then you come in and you repair that relationship and you apologize and you take that accountability. And so that's often what I tell parents is, you know, any little step that we're taking is actually a really big leap, for the lineage. And I think for us as parents, like, we place, and I feel this pressure in myself, and I'm sure that, other parents out there also do. Once we start to become aware and to recognize the impact that we have, we start to place a lot of pressure on ourselves to be different, to change, to shift, to evolve, etc. And I think sometimes that pressure hurts more than it helps, because it puts us in a position of binary of, this is good mothering, this is bad mothering, this is good
Right.
fathering, this is bad fathering. And so when things happen that are out of our control, or there's influence from the schools, or there's influence from media, we take it on, right? And we say, this is, I'm not being a good enough mom that I would be allowing my child to be exposed to this, or whatever it is. But the world is going to be the world, right? So,
Right.
like, as much influence as we do have as parents, we also have to learn how to be extremely gentle and compassionate with ourselves and say, there's no way I'm going to heal 500 years of colonization and systemic oppression in this one lifetime, in this one relationship. I'm going to do the very, very best that I can. But when I slip, because I'm living and breathing and swimming in, the system of white supremacy and colonization and capitalism and all these things, like, I'm going to be compassionate, and I'm not going to point a finger back at my face and say, you didn't heal this, like, you didn't do this enough or well enough. Your children will grow up to hate you. Like, I feel like all of these recordings that we were given as children become reinforced in that parenting relationship when we start to put shame and blame on ourselves for not, being aligned with our intentions. And so all we can
Right.
do is really set the intention, set practices in place where we're all, reflecting in ongoing ways, and practice, right? It's just like, I'm going to practice this. And part of that practice is going to mean regression and coming back and saying, like, oh, I actually don't, like, I didn't do that very well. I'm going to try again the next time. And it's okay. That's what I would want for my kids too. I wouldn't want them to add a layer of shame when they're already feeling bad about something. It's like, okay, well, let's feel the guilt for a second and then let's go on. Because who is it really serving, right? When I just carry guilt about my humanity.
Right, exactly. But that's systemic too, right? Where these external pressures that force so many people to feel like they have to be more than what they already are, when
Yeah.
we are intrinsically worthy exactly as we are, right?
Yeah.
Even in our imperfections, even in our hot messes, even if you're in a bun and pajamas for the entire week and you barely showered, 2 days later, it's perfectly fine, because like everyone is just doing the best job that they can with what we're given. And no life is perfect, and even for people who have privilege, that doesn't mean their life is perfect either,
Yeah.
right? Like, some people are still in survival mode, some people are not at the same journeys as other people, and that's okay. Like really giving yourself grace is so important to part of your healing, because there's only so much that you can do. And again, that's where community comes into play, but reminding yourself that you are worthy of community as well, because
Mhm.
so many of us forget that, right? And I think it's just so important that when you give yourself that grace, it just relieves a lot of pressure for you. Like, when you tell yourself you're worthy, it relieves a lot of pressure for you. One of my favorite things that I was ever taught, that I still practice actually to this day, is to honor every feeling in the moment. So, very much like you said, if someone is feeling guilty, you feel the guilt and then you move on, right? But honoring feelings in the moment may mean, if you're angry, if you're sad, if you're frustrated, if you're being petty, right? You honor those feelings in the moment, and you take a breath. You say thank you to those feelings, and then you move forward with them, like without them or with them, depending on how you need to move through those feelings.
Yeah.
When it comes to grief, having generational trauma, there's a layer of grief that no one really talks about,
Mhm.
right? And I think part of that is also that external pressure that we put on ourselves, is when you've experienced this sort of grief. So many of us, especially, when it comes to going to college or school, or having careers or being members of the society, we put this external pressure of, well, my parents, my loved ones sacrificed, my ancestors sacrificed so much. And if we don't meet those expectations, there's this layer of grief that
Yeah.
people don't recognize or talk about or even acknowledge that it's grief.
And it impacts your parenting. Like, you know
Hmm.
what I mean? And so it's like, we do, because we're a collectivist culture. And I remember recently I was able to, like, get my mom, I co-signed for a car for my mom.
Oh,
And it was such a complex experience in me, because it brought up a lot of, like, what I still would like to accomplish, to honor her and to honor her sacrifice. And then also there was, like, complications with, like, the whole process. And so then I felt, like, angry that I had to, like, deal with this. And I was like, I'm not seeing, like, some of my white friends dealing with their parents, and and I've never never want to get to the point, like I've started observing myself, right? There's like an observation of like, oh, that's where I'm going with the anger. And it actually reminds me of what you're saying, reminds me of like Tara Brach's work and radical self-acceptance and noticing those feelings. But we are so complex in our culture. We have, you know, dualities of emotion at any given point. It's very, very complex. And so while I feel very grateful and very joyful that my mom is now able to, like, you know, drive this car, I'm also like, damn, it has to be me, huh? You know, like, damn, I really, like, I have to be the one to, like, not only buy this car, but like continue to pay for it. And like, that's taking, you know, resources away maybe from my kids too. And so I just want to honor that, you know, for any parents that are holding the complexities of like not only raising children, but like raising ourselves and like really
Right.
nurturing, honoring the experiences of our inner child, which are still very present and are still emerging. But also we're coming into contact with our parents' inner children and like what their lost dreams have been, you know. And so
Yes.
that there's a lot of grief in the fact that, you know, my mom worked as a waitress for and a nanny and like all kinds of, um now they're called what did they call those
All
jobs? And
pairs.
yeah, essential, right?
Oh,
Like
essential,
essential work, which a lot of our parents did, but
which they've always been essential.
they've always been essential, exactly. But you know, just knowing like that sacrifice has, of course, influence the way that I move about, you
Right.
know, my mothering, not wanting my kids to ever feel indebted to me, wanting obviously for there to be a very authentic sense of gratitude and appreciation because we live in Santana. We have a tremendous amount of houseless people here that my kids see every
Mm-hmm.
day. And so like I think that there's value in like seeing the juxtaposition and like having them be very aware of their privileges.
Right.
um, but I wouldn't necessarily want my experience for them, you know. And I don't operate out of fear of giving them that experience. I operate out of like love for what they can accomplish if I heal what I need to heal so that it's not
Right.
projected outward to them.
Right. And it's amazing too because, healing is a continuous journey, right?
Mm,
It's not something that you're 100% healed tomorrow. If there were a drink that, not kombucha, but if there were a drink that you could just drink and then all of a sudden you were healed tomorrow, that'd be amazing. Of
yeah,
all generational trauma, very cool. But yeah, that's just not how healing works. And what I am very proud about, and I'm sure you recognize this in yourself too, and in your own mom, is is that honoring even just the work that they did to heal themselves, so that we could experience this level of healing too. Like
yes, thank you.
like my parents, they work so hard and sacrifice so hard to give my brother and I the lives that we have, and for me to have the confidence and the awareness that I have to be able to help others, right, in this space. And
Yeah,
and I acknowledge how much survival they had to go through, and how much sacrifices they went through, and honoring and giving them thanks for doing the best job that they could, right?
yeah,
Even if I came out with a couple little bruises or scrapes or whatever, with a couple little things that I need to work on, I'm so grateful because it could have been so different from the
yeah,
lives that they experienced and the traumas that they experienced. And it's so beautiful just to see that evolution, to where I can't wait to see what all of our children get to be like, right?
yeah,
Right? Even looking at Gen Z and how
yeah,
empowered they are, and unfortunately empowered in some respect, because they shouldn't have to be. But
yeah,
I'm very heartened with the work that so many of us are doing in this space. And I do hope for a brighter future, and I do look forward to a brighter future, because I see the people who are doing the work on a daily basis, people
yeah,
like you, right? And people like the people that you surround yourself with, and the people that I surround myself with, and so many others who are listening, who y'all surround yourself with. And I say y'all because I'm in Texas.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, so it is an evolution, and it's not something that is overnight by any means. But it's an important journey that we all embark on.
Yeah, it makes me think about this little anecdote that I share sometimes. So we have like the End Chancla Culture movement is like what Latinx parenting is, and we have these beautiful tote bags available for folks to get into arguments with the relatives that say End Chancla Culture on them. That's not really the intention, but it's what might end up happening if you wear something that says chancla and it's against it. But anyway, I had gifted my mom a tote. And she was like, I wish I had gotten la chancla. And I was like, where's this going? And she was like, I wish I had gotten la chancla because what I got was so much worse. She got a horse's whip. She got all kinds of really terrible, terrible beatings, from both her parents and her older siblings, actually. And she was like, if I had la chancla, that would have been better. And I was like, well, I actually like I was punished with corporal punishment, but it wasn't to the degree that she was punished with corporal punishment, right? And so now I have abandoned corporal punishment altogether. But like I said earlier, I was like, my chancletazos are still my yelling or sarcasm or like whenever I'm in my survival mode, right? And so every generation, like you said, is doing a little bit better. And I think we don't always recognize that. I think,
Right.
even just having these conversations with folks, like there's always a hesitation with making the acknowledgments about how we were hurt as children because inherently it feels like we're disrespecting our elders or we're disrespecting the experiences that they had or we're dishonoring the sacrifices that they made by making those acknowledgments. But it's like, no, by understanding the wounds that I'm still working through, I can have extra compassion for the wounds that they're still holding to.
Right.
That inner Nina work for me has been what has extended compassion and empathy outward to my mom, to my dad, and to just say we're all just we're grown inner Ninas, like we're
Yep.
grown and we're still often operating from a lot of those wounds, and that's okay. We just have to recognize when that's happening and be able to discern whether or not we want to continue that or not. Right? And so we're not going to be falling into the binary of like, well, my parents were good parents and my parents were bad parents. It's like, no, my parents did the best they could with what the resources, the information, the community support that they may have had, and I was hurt as a child,
Right.
and I still have things that I'm healing from as a child. And so we don't necessarily have bad parents. We have struggling parents. We have under-resourced parents. We have systemically oppressed parents. We have
Right.
parents who have not been supported by their environments forever, and who are in fear, who are in survival because they don't know if their kids are going to get taken away. They don't know if, and a lot of the child abuse reporting that we talk about, it's like Black and brown families are disproportionately affected,
Yep.
are still separated from their children, and we cause
100%.
trauma. There's a whole movement around this that very much is intertwined with this one. But we have to kind of recognize that like there's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of untangling. I really see it as like there's this big knot that like colonization has woven together, and like you and I are just kind of like untangling it, and like trying to
Right.
figure out like, what strands belong to me and what strands belong to this toxic paradigm.
Yeah. We got to get the peanut butter out.
Yeah.
Spoken like someone with curly long hair.
I didn't even know that was a thing. You can use peanut butter
Oh
for
yeah, peanut butter or because it's like
because it's oil.
oil, and then you can also use ice. Um,
I
Thankfully, my mom did not cut my hair when I got gum stuck in my hair when I was little. She did the peanut butter, and it worked perfectly.
Perfect.
I
Yeah.
mean, it still hurt, but that's besides the point. I digress.
Yeah.
um,
No,
no,
but
but
it is this like just we see. I don't know why I equate it to hair. Maybe it's because I've like had long hair all my life, and so I'm like when we weave the past of our parents, the present of who we are now, and the future of how we're raising our children. And I see it as a trenza, like I do see it as a braid.
yes,
And how do I like weave this braid together, and how do I remove the tangles of what this, it's like you have to untangle it first and then you can start to weave. Right.
Right. Um,
Yeah.
I'll use a story that I like sharing, especially as a nonprofit fundraising consultant, who helps nonprofits all over the world, including amazing ones like American SPCC as the board chair. Um, it's Have you ever heard of the starfish story?
I don't know. Tell me.
So it's there's this beach, and there are thousands of starfish that have been beached by the wave. And so this little boy is picking up starfish and throwing them into the ocean. And this older curmudgeon comes up to the little boy and says, "What are you doing?" And the little boy says, "Oh, I'm saving these starfish." And he just keeps picking them up and throwing them back. And the old man says, "Well, you're not making a difference.
Mm,
All of these are just going to die. You're not making a difference." And
yeah.
the little boy, with just so much determination, looks at him dead in the eye, picks up another starfish and says, "I made a difference for that one." And then does
Mm,
it again. And I think it's such an important lesson, especially as we're weaving these moments of healing, right? Is we may not be perfect in how we're healing. We may
mhm,
not have all the tools. We may not have all the resources. We may not even have community or people next to us to help us out of survival mode, right?
mm,
But every baby step that we take makes a huge difference and really does make a huge impact, because your children see that. Other
yeah.
children see that. And even just kindness to yourself, grace to yourself, it makes a huge difference. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect every day, but those little baby steps, those little baby hairs, if we want to call them that, right? You can still make a baby braid.
Yeah.
You can still do what you can with what you're given, and it matters.
Yeah.
Every moment matters. And I like I'm so grateful even to, like, my grandparents and even like the other ancestors, where if they didn't take the baby steps they took, my parents wouldn't have gotten to the level that they did,
Yeah.
right? And
Mhm.
similarly, if my parents didn't take the sacrifice that they made, I wouldn't be where I am, and similarly to your mom. And so, when we, like Maya Angelou says, right, when we know better, do better.
Mhm.
And so I think that's where having these free resources, or even just the resources that you have, like your escuelitas,
Yeah.
right, are just so empowering and so important, because it's not about perfection. It's
Mhm.
just about meeting people where they're at, so
Mhm.
that we can actually address, ACEs, like adverse childhood effects, to create the PCEs, which are the positive childhood,
Yeah.
effects, and those opportunities where every moment is just weaving that braid.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, and I think, one of the things that when I was working at the agency, I was teaching about 7 classes a week. I was teaching every morning, 2-hour classes, and then twice a week, 2 or 3 times a week, I would teach in the evenings as well. And I would be working with mostly Latina mothers, is what it was, in elementary schools all over Orange County where I live. But I would also have experience working in transitional homes, drug rehabilitation centers. I worked with teen moms.
Mhm.
And one of the experiences that I had working with the teen mothers, was that I came in there and very quickly realized that the agenda that I had to go out the window
Yeah.
immediately. It was like, I'm not going to talk to you about brain development. Like, you don't even trust me. I'm an adult. In your
Mhm.
mind, I'm an enemy. Like, my main agenda now is to just be a container for whatever you're holding, and to be a connection point so that maybe at some point I will be a resource, right? There was a mom there that was very interested and was very, she was always taking notes, and she was just like very, very in it. So it was like one of 12 moms, right? The other moms were like texting and like making fun of me under their breath. And that was, as a young educator, I had to be like, wow, like that's activating to my inner teenager. Right? Like, oh, these mean girls, right? Like they're making fun of me. But anyway, I very quickly realized, and I think that it applied also to my parenting journey and to like my journey in navigating boundaries with my mom is like my mom, my dad, my family. I can't have an agenda. I can have an intention, but I can't have an agenda of how this is going to go. Because if I have an agenda of like, okay, my children are going to be raised in this way and they're going to grow up to be these people, it's like I might be able to have an intention of the kind of kids that I want, but to have an agenda is going to set me up for disappointment. And to have an agenda of my parents and like their healing process also is going to set me up for disappointment. And so
Right.
just realizing like the only thing that I can really control is my own energy, my own intentions, like my own ability to foster community, to model that for other people. And this is why I'm like, I don't want to be seen as like a guru. I just want to be seen as like an example of like what's possible for everybody else. Right. And to build your own spaces and to like have these conversations on your own. Because there's never going to be a shortage of them. We're never
Right.
going to shortage of the need for parent support because it is the hardest job in the world.
Right.
Um, but I think that experience really taught me to like really release our agendas of what we think that people need and to just attune, just to
Mm-hmm.
tune in and from a place of heart. And I think that colonization has separated our minds from our hearts to the point where we don't operate very much from this space. We operate from what makes sense here. And while
Right.
we value in what's happening here, if we're not operating from a heart space, it's going to be harder to like move about, our relationships in our world.
Right. Well, and when you're decolonizing these mindsets, right? It's hard for your heart and your mind to be synced when there are a lot of mindsets that are so ingrained within you
Hmm.
that everything feels real.
Yeah.
Right? And so when you start decolonizing your mindset and you start healing from a lot of these cultural norms,
Mm-hmm.
um, it feels fake. It doesn't feel real,
Yeah.
and even when you are coming out of survival mode, it's this you feel you feel like what's next? When is the next shoe going to drop because you were so used to survival mode.
Yeah.
And so I think that's so important that you just meet people where they're at,
Yeah.
and you release the expectation of agendas,
Yeah.
because you can only help people where they're at in the moment,
Yeah.
and you won't know that until you ask and you're there and you
Yeah.
show up. I do like I know you don't want to take credit, but I do want to validate you because you do such important work, and you should validate yourself because that is also a matter of decolonizing. So I do want to encourage you and empower you to like take ownership and claim like all that you do for communities, specifically communities of color and our Latinx communities, because you really do make a huge difference and you are a catalyst of that and you are light. Even if you are one of many lights, you are a very bright light. And so I definitely want to empower you to claim that blessing,
Yeah.
because that is you. You are doing this work.
Yeah.
Um,
I do feel like very chingona sometimes,
good.
just,
Good. You should. Yeah. Like
but I also,
poderosa, chingona, all the
yeah, I
above.
also know that that's something that I was given permission to embody that like by my elders and by my teachers as well, and so I feel like we strive this balance of like I'm not, and I've seen this like in the parenting world and in like the healing world. It's like there are a lot of people that are taking credit for work that they didn't necessarily begin, right? Or like
Right.
they're not necessarily giving credit. And so I feel like for me, it's like I want to give credit where credit is due. And I do give myself credit for being able to like take the lessons, and just say like, okay, like I know how to put this puzzle together for myself. But I really want to honor my elders also, and I want to honor
Absolutely.
Eagle Hole and Sylvia Puero and, my teacher, Maestra Teresa and Maestro Ricardo, like all of these people that by the grace of God or the universe or creator or, whatever you want to call it, like have come
Right.
into my life to really give me the permission to speak on universal things. Like this is not inaccessible either. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like I'm just packaging it in my own way and I'm expressing it in my own way and you're expressing it in your own way, right? And
Right.
there's so many things that we've talked about even just here where it's like, oh, this is this, but like to you it's this and to me it's this. And so
Yes.
um And that feels really good. Like that's what to me, like that's what success is when we can make these points of connection, and like you can resonate and really like feel into the things that I'm sharing, and vice versa. Like that's what feels like, oh yeah, I'm a chingona, but I'm only a chingona in the context of my community. you know?
Well, I mean, I would say a lot more than just your community. But I think that's been a hard lesson too, right? Is um, honoring our elders who have given us the permission to embody our chingonaness and our power, like our power, right?
Yeah,
It is great, but it's not mutually exclusive to us honoring our own innate power that's within us because of the hard
yeah,
work that we've also come up and sacrificed and
yeah,
risen to the occasion, if you will, right? So you were talking about your elder, and I do really like want to ask this question of where your elder, Manuel Zamaripa of the
mhm,
Institute of Chicano Psychology, he said
yeah.
that many indigenous communities believe children hold innate wisdom that needs to be honored. So we've talked a lot about honoring your emotions, but what's a lesson that your own children have taught you of honoring and has brought healing to your own inner child as you're working to heal others in their inner child as well?
I think the word that comes up is from Maestro Jerry Theo. He has a book called Recovering Your Sacredness, right? And so just the word sacredness is like,
Sacred,
oh, I'm sacred and I've always been sacred. And I think one of the first times that I recognized this, even if I didn't use this language for it, was when my daughter was born. I had a home birth. And I remember when she was here, I looked at her and I was just like, wow, I am you. Like this was me. This is all of us. Like I had this very like cosmic moment in that 1 second of looking at her being like, I am you, and feeling that for myself, like that love that I was emitting to her, I also felt for myself as a vessel that was able to birth this and to create this and to understand
right,
how, and so for me it is about recovering our sacredness, and it is about coming back to the truth of who we are. um,
right,
Indigenous folks and the values of indigeneity do teach us these lessons, and so I think that for us it's about remembering them. It's not even
absolutely,
new. It's just what is asked of us to really reconnect to the truth about ourselves and our sacredness, and our capacity to work in tandem with Madre Tierra, and to work in communion with the
right,
elements. And so I feel very grateful that I've been for the last year or so in a program of curanderismo apprenticeship,
yes,
and I, you know, I'm just like, because, and I consider myself at this point, I'm like, if I am a practitioner of curanderismo, that I feel like I'm a consejera right now, right? I'm just like, this is like I'm talking through certain things with people,
right. You're still
and
learning,
yes, I'm still learning. I'm very much like, and I think that that's another thing is like in that sacredness, like we are also forever students, and
yes,
so things at the end of the trainings that I give, sometimes I'm just like, here's 8 hours of like what I've put together. But at the end of it, I'm just like, we don't know anything, like we know nothing actually. And so I don't know anything, you don't know anything. And like, let's move in that way where we're just learning and we're just curious and we're holding people's humanity as the focal point in our vision of them, and like and that's another part of decolonization, because in colonial paradigms, you are in judgment, you're in evaluation, you're looking at this person as good or bad, you're looking at them as victim or perpetrator, you're looking at them as offender, or, all of these concepts and judgments and labels. And it's like, no, like that's not the truth. The truth is that
right,
all of us have the capacity to cause harm and the capacity to be harmed as well. And so that applies to our children, it applies to our parents, it applies to anybody. And so I go back to that, to those indigenous beliefs, and to really affirming that that's what the truth is, and that
right,
else has been a lie, that has been told to us so that certain systems can continue. and certain people can profit and kind of step on everybody else. And so, that's, I think, what I want to pass down to my children is like, no, we're just remembering, like we're remembering that we're sacred. We're remembering, even helping my daughter navigate her social relationships. Like I will ask her, and we have the conversation around needs, like, okay, like what emotion was experienced there? And I use the framework of nonviolent communication with her, which is what I teach also in the parenting classes. But what need is there? We do villains work, right? I do villains work with my children. So whenever there's any movie, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about like Ursula, like
Right.
what she might have gone through as a child, and like what
Yeah.
has led her into stealing other people's voices. How do you
Right.
think that's reflected in like her story? And so I feel like we can take all kinds of situations or like experiences and say like, how do I make this applicable and like have this be something that I can share a lesson, even if it's like a subtle message, like I can still
Right.
introduce that framing for her and for my other two as well, but they're little.
Right. Well, and it's amazing too because those lessons stick with children.
Yeah.
Like they really, really do. And it's amazing how even stories like that, or even like The Little Mermaid, right?
Yeah.
Can change as you get older.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. But I love that you said that part of your healing was really reclaiming your indigeneity.
Mhm.
And for so many of us, Black and brown individuals, that reclamation has been part of our healing journey.
Yes.
And honoring it because for so many of us, it was erased
Yes.
and it was kept down and repressed, and so many of us, you know having that reclamation into healing, curandissima, like, right, like it's just so empowering and so important to not only our culture, because that's what honors our real culture, right, is when we come back to our indigeneity and come back to the ancestors, and their sacrifices, and not in a way of feeling indebted, but in gratitude,
Hmm.
right? So I was very privileged that last week, I actually got to listen to Angela Davis and Omi Jones, and Omi made a comment. It was in Yoruba, which very similar to like Kurandera Yoruba, and like African Black healers,
Hmm.
um, you know, there's a lot of similarities, but she made this phrase, and it was in Yoruba, so I'm not gonna like ruin how you say it, but the meaning of it was hands tying hands. And I love that you said, you share 8 hours worth of amazing content of how you do this and all these tools, and very similar to American SPCC, we provide all these tools and these resources, right? But at the end of the day, it is hands tying hands and recognizing that none of us know everything immediately.
Hmm.
We may have these tools and resources, and we can give you guideposts and guidelines, but at the end of the day, it's going to be all of us working together,
Yeah.
tying hands to each other,
Yeah.
weaving those trenzas, like the braids,
Hmm.
taking the different parts and finding healing where we can, and giving ourselves grace through all of it.
Yeah.
And so I love that you said that has been part of your healing journey, not just for yourself, but as you work in this movement,
Yeah.
and as we are all working in these different movements, right? Because I know I'm doing the same even in my own work.
Yeah.
So I just love hearing that. And I know we are coming up a little bit to time. We've had an amazing conversation, but I do want to give you the opportunity to share a little bit more about your escuelitas, and the work that you're doing and the different classes you're giving. And then even, what are you most excited about when partnering with American SPCC? So tell me all the things.
Yeah, yeah. So I will share that Escuelita is our educational platform. And so if you go to latinxparenting.org/Escuelita, ESCUELITA, You will find a lot of our pre-recorded courses. The majority of them also come with ebooks, and you also gain access immediately into our membership community just by virtue of having, purchased one of the courses. They're also sliding scale, and so people cannot, and we offer scholarship for everything as well. And so we really want to prioritize accessibility and those kinds of things. And so, we're always open to being reached out to if people need a scholarship or they need to access it for less than the price that it is right now. I also have a team that I'm paying. And so I'm like, if you can't afford it, please do, because it goes to, feed my team's family. But I wanted to really invite people to check that out. We have Healing the Madre Wound is one of the courses, Ending Chancla Culture, where I really talk about the history of Chancla Culture, what to do about it, like what foundations to set to kind of end Chancla culture in your own home and in your own communities. I have the Intro to Decolonize Nonviolent Parenting, which really gives that framework of decolonization together with nonviolence. And then we have the Professionals Intensive, which is an 8-hour training that we hold twice a year. The next one is happening in March. And so if you are a professional, a school teacher, a therapist, we've had dentists come, we've had doulas come, we've had all kinds of, like, we're planning a training right now for judges in
I
Texas.
love it.
And so there's, anybody that's really working with the Latinx community, the Latina community, is invited to come to that. And that is something that is already open for registration on the Escuelita page. And I think what's most exciting for me about working with you, working with ASPCC, is just having this relationship. Like, I feel like this is just like so exciting, like the mutuality that I feel in this connection and in this relationship just feels very much aligned with my values of being in collaboration and of being in community. And so it's not like, this is what I'm gonna gain. I'm gonna like gain this from you, because that's just not the paradigm that we're living in. And so I think what I'm just enjoying is being in conversation like this, and and I really hope that the people that watch this conversation feel inspired and feel really motivated to keep learning and to be that forever student and to, continue to heal and liberate our lineages.
Absolutely. And I do want to share, for those interested in taking your Escuelita, that throughout all of your verbiage, you were so intentional of really putting on the page that every single parent that comes in, is not met from a space of judgment, like,
Right.
at all. And I know we've said this throughout this conversation, but I wanted to just give that grace again to anyone watching, because even when we see those resources, of honoring where we need extra support, right? It's important. I would just wanted them to know that you come from a place of non-judgment and you come from a place of grace. And it's not about fixing it immediately. It's about just, again, meeting parents where they're at. And that's really like where healing starts, is by like meeting people where they're at, and honoring them where they're at, so that they can find the tools and resources necessary. Not about being perfect, but about the baby steps along the way.
Yeah, no one's perfect, just me.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. Well, yeah, exactly. That's it. I
Yeah.
can't even pretend to say, if I were to say like, oh yeah, I'm so perfect,
Yeah,
I couldn't even say the word, because it's like word vomit. I'm like,
no, I was like, I'm perfect. Like, I think all of us are perfectly imperfect, right? It's just like, it's about like navigating the imperfections and saying, like, it's like you said, it's not the goal to be perfect, it's just to progress, it's just to move forward, it's just to take us, even if you are two steps, one step forward, two steps back some days, at least you still took that step forward. And so there's so much value that I want to give, and validation that I want to give to parents, that it's enough, you are enough,
exactly as
you
you are.
are the right parent for your children, because
Hmm.
here you are. And there is no shame, there is no judgment in accessing that support, whether it's from me, whether it's from other resources and professionals that ASBCC works with. There's really only good that can come from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. I'm so grateful for you. I'm so thankful that you took the time to chat with us today. And I can't wait to see how people are just, like, positively impacted through your escalitas and through the information you share through American SBCC. But also, as I said before, as we continue to tie hands with each other, not only American SBCC and Latinx parenting, but just all of us and parents and children who are afraid of becoming parents, right? And grandparents and every single generation. I really look forward to